For me, my first experience having an educator of color would have to be my 5th grade year in music class. And while that was great having an educator of color, it just wasn't encouraging that, yes, they were an educator, but it wasn't in like a core subject, knowing that I want to teach a core subject, but having her be there, it like broadened my eyes to see that there is someone that looks like me, and that's something I can obtain in the future. And it helps me realize that having a person of color, it encouraged me to want to keep learning because I could look at someone to relate to, unlike with my other teachers that are not of color. While they were there to help me and guide me through my years of education, having her there was more of something to relate to.
My first teacher of color was in the 5th grade. Her name was Mrs. Hernandez, and she was Latina. She was my only teacher of color that I had while I was in public school, and she was also a music teacher in my elementary school. She didn't have too profound of an impact on me personally, but it was interesting as I reflect on it how I grew up in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood, and a lot of the students were Hispanic. They spoke Spanish as their first language, and Mrs. Hernandez was the only teacher in the whole elementary school who could speak Spanish. So for them, she was a huge asset. Recess, somebody gets hurt, Mrs. Hernandez is the one who's calling parents. Kids are hungry, they go to Mrs. Hernandez to ask. It was really powerful for those students who couldn't even understand a lot of their teachers to have a teacher who not only could understand them, could speak to them in a way that was powerful for them, but also looked like them. So while I didn't have an experience with any Black teachers in my public education career, that was powerful for me in reflecting on the work I want to do as a teacher.
Thank you. Now we'll discuss the impact of having a teacher of color. Research shows that not only will having teachers of color in schools impact students of color, but overall impact the experience that all students have in their schools. So could you talk a little bit more, each of you, about how having a teacher of color shaped your educational journey and how it shaped the outcome of what you've decided to either do after high school or what your plans may be after high school?
So again, my experience with educators of color was my 7th grade year. And I'm actually at NC A&T State studying middle grades education, social studies, and language arts now. So it was my 7th grade social studies teacher who actually, really, I just felt like I could relate to him. I felt comfortable having conversations with him when there was controversial topics going on in the news. I felt like I could talk to him almost as a resource in how to cope, whereas with other teachers I might not feel as comfortable. So I really think that my 7th grade year again opened my eyes to what I wanted to do, because while I went to a school where there were a lot of people who looked like me, again, there weren't a lot of teachers who looked like me. And so it made me realize that one day I want to have an impact on students like he had an impact on me.
Well, yes, my first experience in having an educator of color was in 5th grade. I didn't have another one until high school, and that is really when they started to impact me and really for me to decide, oh, educating is what I want to do in my life. And it's not that I had a specific teacher that taught me, it's just that they were in the environment and affected the other teachers that weren't of color and how they were able to connect with me even though they didn't have a direct connection with me as a teacher of color would. So I've seen one of my teachers go to a teacher of color and say, you have this connection with this student, what can I do to better my connection with them and teach them as best as I can? And I think that really helps, because me looking at that, yes, me as a person of color, I can help the students of color in my classroom, but they're not the only ones in the classroom. I have to be able to connect with everyone else. So me, by using my peers and watching other people use their peers, it will help me be able to educate the students better.
Yeah, so there's a couple axes or dimensions that I think about this on. Firstly, as a black man, it's obvious that I need to do my best to support other black people who are going to be in my future classroom, and to give them an example of a professional black person with a career that can go to work every day and do work that traditionally we don't associate with black men, especially intellectual work. As a queer person, it's even more important, I think, to be an example of how the demonization of queer people in education is super disastrous for queer students. So I think that both of those dimensions make it even more powerful, considering I didn't have any queer teachers and I didn't have any black teachers. So it's obvious to me that that's something that I should do, I guess.
That is wonderful. And so, coming off of that question, many of you talked about the absence of having teachers who shared identities with you. Were you comfortable discussing identities such as race or sexuality, or any of the identities that you held that you didn't feel were shared by your teachers or even your administrators at your schools?
So I'll think back to when we saw a rise in brutality, I guess police brutality, and I felt like I wasn't able to talk to some teachers about it, just because you don't want to go to a math class where you're learning about stuff and have conversations about what's going on in the news. And so I think when I see people who look like me, I know that they had to show up to work the next day despite what was going on, just like I had to show up to school the next day despite what was going on. And so while I may not have had those conversations, I definitely did feel more comfortable, like if I wanted to have a conversation with someone. And so I'll also say in classroom spaces, we always talk about diversity and inclusion, and we've learned so much that diversity is not only related to race, and Trey touched on this, but I know I've had many peers who identify within the LGBT community who were experiencing issues in classrooms that did not feel comfortable enough to talk to an administrator or a teacher about that. So I think it's definitely important that we have people in classrooms who are able to discuss and feel comfortable having discussions with students who might not hold identities with them as well.
The lack of teachers of color in schools, I feel like it greatly affects students of color a lot. Like, for example, in elementary school is when it hit me the hardest, I would say, because when you're a little girl, you are copying everything you see around you, all the adults that are are your influence. So for me, it's like I'm missing a part of the identity that I should have, like, let's say the black side of me, that's what people call it. The term whitewashed had come upon me because I was copying what I was seeing. So for me to then go to high school and have all these educators of color to base how I want to live my life, it made me become a person that I like to see and have different experiences than I was experiencing in elementary school. Like, if I would have braids or something, I would get looked at a certain way because it just wasn't the norm. But to have teachers in my school now have the same hairstyles as me and do the same activities as me, it helps me feel like, oh, I'm okay, everything I'm doing is acceptable. But that shouldn't be how it is, because that's not okay for anyone to feel like that.
Yeah, so I immediately think about the experience that I know we all had in Teacher Cadet, which is a high school class that's based on encouraging people to get into the education pipeline and become teachers, principals, counselors, etc. And in that class, we had a white teacher, Stephanie Moss, who's sitting right over there, and we had a lot of productive conversations about race and equity in that class. I think because it was obvious what we all wanted to do and what we were all interested in accomplishing. I think that in a lot of classrooms in high school, other classrooms where we were having conversations about race, social studies, English, it wasn't always the most productive space. Not necessarily because the teachers weren't having these conversations, weren't bringing up these topics at all, but maybe because they weren't facilitating the types of conversations that they wanted to see between students of color and our high school's predominantly white counterparts. So I definitely had positive experiences talking about race in high school and discussing these topics, even with my white teachers. It's something that I want to make sure that I can do in my classroom is provide a space for students of different colors, sexualities, people with different native languages to participate in these types of productive conversations that white, English-speaking people get to have in high school that end up forming, that's where you get your political beliefs from often. You start coming up with your identity in high school. So it's important that you're having those conversations, and it's important that you're having them in a way that includes as many people as possible.
I love that you all touched on the whole concept of one, just reaffirming who you all are, but also being able to talk across difference and the intersectionality of all the identities that we bring to the classroom. So my last question is about belonging. Oftentimes belonging is a stronger indicator of how good you feel about the spaces you're in. And so how were you all, despite the differences in identity, able to create a sense of belonging within your classrooms, with your teachers, and in your schools?
I would say it's definitely finding your community. So in your classrooms, finding peers that you relate with, peers that might hold similar identities, and then talking to them about your experience at that school, talking to them about your experience in a classroom or experience with a teacher, and collectively coming up with ways to navigate systems that might not have been built for them. And so I think it's really important that these students, moving forward, learn to find communities in classroom, even when the school might not feel welcoming or opening to them, because it's all about who you surround yourself with. And I've learned that during my experience throughout K-12 education, and even now at a predominantly white institution.
In my opinion, I believe that in order for students to find a sense of belonging, it all starts with the teachers in their classrooms, because what goes on in the classroom depends on what the teacher will allow to happen. And having seen different cliques form based on what's cool and what's not cool will determine how a kid feels about themselves throughout their whole lives. Say someone comes up to you and say, just because you do these things and have these beliefs, you should act this certain way, when that's not the case. But then to have another kid do another things and they're praised for it because that's the social norm, that creates a sense of not belonging. But if you have a teacher that sets these rules and guidelines about, this is a space where it's okay to be who you are and it's okay to have different beliefs than someone else, then it becomes a community and they all have a sense of belonging because they will have someone to be able to go to instead of being basically alone. But when you have a teacher like Miss Wallace in our class, we all different backgrounds, all different races, all different sexualities, we were all be able to come together and be like a little family, because despite all of our differences and different beliefs politically, it doesn't matter, we were all accepting of one another, because she set the example that just because you are this way and you were this way, it doesn't mean you're better than anyone. So by having a teacher that can show you that the right and wrong is, it will help.
Yeah, definitely. Teacher Cadet was a great time where we could all find belonging in having a common passion, drive, and desire to at least learn more about education and how important of a career field it was. Finding belonging is, I would probably say, the most important thing that we have to try to get kids to do in high school is, fit into the social world that they're going to enter when they graduate, whether they want to or not, whether they go to college, into the workforce, military. They have to be social people if we want them to work in our society. So I think that's the responsibility of teachers. Like both of my counterparts said here, that's the responsibility of educators to facilitate the type of social connections that form naturally when you have, 2,000 kids running around a building together. And the way that they can do that safely and productively is by being having a representative teacher class that can understand the different social groups that students come from. And that's why we're all here. So, yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank Christian, Amaya, and Trey for joining us today. Their experiences shed light on some of the ways that teachers, educators, community members can create spaces and be advocates and pioneers for the execution of an educational system that prioritizes teacher diversity.